This week you have been teaching in a mini course called Law, Literature and Human Rights. What are you trying to accomplish in this course? How did you organize it for our group?
Okay, so you are correct. The course is called Law, Literature and Human Rights, and it was a series of 4 lectures followed by 4 discussions. So each day I gave a lecture, and in the second session we had a discussion. At the end of the lecture there was an opportunity for questions, and the questions continued during the second session, and we had a more general discussion. And my purpose in teaching this course was to make all of the participants aware of the possibility of teaching legal and political philosophy through the study of literature. Not every great work of literature has a political or legal or philosophical dimension, but many works of literature have more political and legal dimensions, aspects than people realize. And I believe that studying literature sometimes can be very useful for persons who are interested in political philosophy and legal philosophy. Why do I believe that? Why do I think that studying literature can be useful for political philosophers and legal philosophers? Well, I think it's largely because of the nature of literature. And by this I mean, literature, as we all know, if it's great literature, it involves very concrete situations, concrete problems, characters with many interesting attributes, many interesting features relating to their personality, their behavior, their personal history. And because of all of these things that we find in literature, I think it's usually the case that if a literary work, it could be a novel, it could be a play, it could be a short story, it could be a novella, if a literary work is engaged with a question relating to political philosophy or legal philosophy, I think that the question will become very alive. It will become perhaps even more alive than it is in political philosophy or legal philosophy, because in political philosophy or legal philosophy the questions tend to be very abstract, and some people might say that the questions tend to be a little bit dry. Now, I don't believe that the questions in political philosophy and legal philosophy are dry, but that's a common impression. What I think many people would say is that in political and legal philosophy, the question sometimes is very abstract. And so studying important philosophical questions relating to law and politics, studying such questions in literature makes the questions themselves more concrete. It makes the questions more vivid, more lifelike. And I think that this approach, studying political and legal philosophy through literature, it complements, it's not a complete substitution, but it complements the study of political and legal philosophy as independent academic disciplines. And for this course, the organization was rather simple. I thought that it would be easiest if all of the participants in the course, all of the members of the group, read the text in Russian, because for our group here in Ukraine, all of the participants speak Russian, all of the participants read Russian, and I thought that if we could find Russian translations of the literary works that I was planning to assign, it would be easy for all the participants to read the text before we met, and we could have discussions. I, of course, gave my lectures in English. I was reading the text in the original English, and I learned from previous experience teaching in Russia in the city of Irkutsk at the state university there, that this approach can work. The group can read the text in Russian, I read the text in English, I give my lectures in English, and we can have the discussion generally in English, but sometimes maybe we we will talk in Russian. So this was actually very easy for me to organize. I discussed the idea with Sergei, who's the director of the program, and he told me that he liked the idea, and for me it was very pleasant to do this.
Which text did you choose for this mini-course and why?
So this week we spent 4 days reading and discussing four texts, four different texts, and all 4 of these texts are considered classics of either British or American literature. We read 3 texts by English writers, and we read 1 text by an American writer. So let me say a little bit about each of the 4 texts. First, I will give the names of the text and the author, and then I will explain why I chose these 4 texts. So on Monday we read William Shakespeare's play Merchant of Venice. On Tuesday we read Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure. On Wednesday we read the novella by the American writer Herman Melville, the novella known as Billy Budd. Some people consider this a short story, but I think it's usually described as a novella, a very short novel. And on Thursday, for Thursday's lecture and discussion, we read Joseph Conrad's short story, Heart of Darkness. Let me say a little bit about why I chose each of these texts. So I begin with Merchant of Venice. Merchant of Venice, in my judgment, is a great play about law. And literature professors, scholars of English literature, scholars of Shakespeare's plays, most of them agree that Shakespeare wrote 2 great plays about law, and Merchant of Venice is one of them. Merchant of Venice is a play that is in many different ways controversial. It's controversial because many people believe that the play itself has anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish views in it. And it's certainly a play that can be interpreted in many different ways. The play is fundamentally about law, and it's about some problems that can result in law when people are using the law for different purposes, such as seeking revenge. I think that Merchant of Venice tells us many things about the law in society. It also tells us something about how people see the law in a society where there is a significant religious conflict. So in the play, there is significant religious conflict between the Jewish community and the Christian community in the city of Venice. And the events in the play are taking place around the time of Shakespeare's life. The second day we read Shakespeare's other great play about law. This is Measure for Measure. And Measure for Measure is, I don't think, one of Shakespeare's most popular plays. Many literature scholars call it a problem play. And by that, they mean that the full meaning of the play is hard to understand. It's hard to know. Nonetheless, Measure for Measure is an important play. It's a play that people can still read today and learn from, especially people who are interested in political and legal philosophy. The play is interesting, in my opinion, because it depicts a social crisis in the city of Vienna. Merchant of Venice takes place in Venice. Measure for Measure takes place in Vienna, in Austria. And the social crisis has to do with the fact that for a few different reasons, no one in Vienna is really getting married. And the city of Vienna might be on the verge of a crisis because at the beginning of the play, it is admitted that there might be a war with Hungary very soon. And it could be described, the situation in Vienna could be described as something of a moral crisis. People are not getting married. Most of the men in the city are going to houses of prostitution for sexual gratification, marriages in a very bad state, and nobody seems to know how this problem can be solved, except the Duke. And the interesting thing is that the Duke himself was largely responsible for the problem developing in the first place. So that's one interesting thing about Measure for Measure. Again, it's something that would interest political and legal philosophers who want to examine how a modern society, city of Vienna, could possibly deal with a significant social crisis relating to the collapse or breakdown of marriage. The third literary work that we read is Herman Melville's novella called Billy Budd. And Billy Budd, in my judgment, is a classic work of literature that deals with an urgent question in legal philosophy. And by this I mean simply that Billy Budd defines a question that has long interested legal philosophers, and the question has to do with the competing claims of the positive law and what we might call natural justice. Billy Budd is a story about a young man who is falsely accused of a crime, and who, in response to this false accusation, does something very bad. What is the philosophic significance of the story? Well, as I said, the young man is falsely accused. He does something very bad after the false accusation, and from the standpoint of the positive law, the young man needs to be punished, it seems, very strictly. But from the standpoint of natural justice, it seems that this young man is innocent. So Billy Budd by Herman Melville is an exploration of these competing claims of the positive law versus the idea of natural justice. And then on Thursday, I lectured on and we discussed Joseph Conrad's story, maybe it's a novella or a short story, known as Heart of Darkness. And Heart of Darkness has a reputation of being one of the most important works, perhaps the most important literary work about European imperialism at the end of the 19th century. Speaking specifically of the European entry into Africa and the colonization of much of sub-Saharan Africa at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. And Conrad's Heart of Darkness is a work that should be of interest to political philosophers and legal philosophers, but especially, I think, political philosophers, because it's an exploration of the corruption that accompanied the colonization of Africa. The corruption is seen in the life of one man, a very mysterious man known as Kurtz, and the story explores the different reasons that people offered that Europeans offered in colonizing Africa. So, for example, we see that some of the people think that it's important to go to Africa to bring the Christian religion there. And other people believe that the main reason for the colonization of Africa is to make money. And in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, we see an obsession with the Belgian trading company. The Belgian trading company, all the people working for it have an obsession with ivory, which was at that time very much desired, and the basis of this economic adventure into Central Africa that Conrad describes. So those are the literary works that we read and that we discussed, and I think some of them are of interest to political philosophers more than legal philosophers, and others might be of greater interest to legal philosophers than political philosophers.
David, what are some of the actual or potential problems in teaching political or legal philosophy through literature?
So some of the problems I discussed earlier this week, and I think that these problems are not especially serious, but it's worth mentioning them, it's worth discussing them a little bit. Perhaps some of the participants in this group might be interested in trying to teach some literary texts as part of the courses that they regularly teach. Different members of the group have told me that they teach primarily legal philosophy. Others have told me that they teach primarily political philosophy. So let me just mention a few of the potential or actual problems as I understand them. So one thing that's important is that if the teacher is going to be using a translation, the teacher should try to find the best translation possible. And what is necessary for this? Well, usually it means if the teacher is a specialist in law or political philosophy or legal philosophy, usually to determine, to know which translation is the best, or if there are several translations, which of the translations are the best. It's necessary to look at literary journals, the journals published by professors, scholars of literature, and to read what the literature professors, the literature scholars are saying about different translations. So, for example, I know this week several of the participants were reading the same translation of Billy Budd, and I cannot comment because I did not study the text so closely. I cannot comment on the quality of the translation, but I can mention that I was a little surprised that the translation that was being used has 26 chapters, and the English language edition of Billy Budd that I have has 30 chapters. Now, this is not a terrible problem, but I believe now, according to scholars, literature scholars in the United States, the accepted edition, the best edition of Billy Budd has 30 chapters. That is, if somebody buys Billy Budd in the United States, if it's a good edition of the text, it will have 30 chapters. So this is something that to try to get the best translation, the best edition of a particular literary text, it's going to be necessary for legal and political philosophers to do what we call interdisciplinary research. So they must go into another academic discipline and try to learn something about what scholars in that discipline are writing, what their judgments are about some important literary matter. So the quality of translation is a significant matter, and I encourage anybody who wants to teach legal or political philosophy through literature to try to find the best translation possible. Or perhaps for some literary works there are many translations, and perhaps maybe there are two or three translations that are very good, and some translations are very bad, and a few that are average. So it doesn't mean always that there will be one translation which is obviously the best, but it's going to be necessary for the teacher to do some research, to do some investigating, to find out the best translation or the best translations. What else can I say? I have found in my experience that reading a lot of commentaries, literary commentaries, is helpful. Why? Because literature as an artistic discipline, literature as an artistic discipline depends on a great writer or a good writer telling a story with a lot of details, with a lot of interesting nuances. Usually it requires a lot of artistic talent to write a great play or a great novel or a great short story. And the challenge for me, as somebody who is not a professor of literature, not an expert in literature, the challenge for me is to gradually, little by little, come to a good understanding of the literary text so that I can have a free discussion with my students. And this much I can say from my experience, that if I am leading a discussion about a literary text, obviously I must know the text better than my students. So maybe my students are going to read the text once. Maybe my very good students will read it twice before we have finished and begun our discussion. But I know that I must read the text several times before I can lead the discussion and lead it in a constructive way. It's really the obligation of the teacher to know the text better than any of the students of the room, better than any of the students in the room, any of the students in the teacher's class. And that often means that the instructor, the teacher, the professor must read a lot of commentary to lead the discussion. Now, I don't want to exaggerate here. I'm not saying that the professor must read all of the commentaries on a literary work, because that would be impossible. I mean, I do not know if I did nothing for the rest of my life except read commentaries on Shakespeare. I don't know if I don't think I would ever finish reading such commentaries. But somebody who is teaching political or legal philosophy is obviously an intelligent person, and so that person must use his or her judgment to make decisions about the most helpful commentaries. And I would even suggest that in teaching a classic literary work as an exercise in political or legal philosophy, the teacher should be prepared to share some of the commentaries with the students. But at a minimum, the teacher must be willing to read these commentaries as a way of preparing for the lectures and then the discussion. So those are a few of the problems, and I don't think that these problems are so difficult. They just require a certain amount of attention and a little bit of work on the part of the teacher to solve the problems.
Do you have any advice or recommendation for teachers who might want to teach legal or political philosophy through literature?
Well, I think I gave some advice in my answer to the last question about potential or actual problems associated with teaching political and legal philosophy through literature. But I could make a few more suggestions here, offer a little bit more advice. The first general recommendation that I would make is that the professor, the teacher should choose a text or choose a few texts that he or she is enthusiastic about. There's no reason, there's no point to choosing a text that the teacher is not so enthusiastic about. And the teacher should be looking, or should just be reflecting, if the teacher wants to try to do something like this, should be reflecting on his or her own experience with literature. The teacher should be asking himself or herself, which literary text do I like the most, and do these literary texts raise any important questions about political or legal philosophy? Now, this week, several of the participants have told me that they have read some of the works that we read, that we read for our discussions. They read them earlier in their lives. They read some of them when they were in school. Some of them they read when they were in university, and some of them were read as young adults after the completion of university. And some of the participants have said to me that they did not realize, they did not understand that these literary works have these legal and political questions in them, these philosophical questions in them. And I guess this is related to the nature of reading. We read some things when we're young, We read some things that we like very much when we were in school, but then if we read them again later in our lives, we understand that they are much richer than we imagined. And the recommendation here would be, my recommendation is that before any teacher begins searching for literary works that might be used to teach political and legal philosophy, the teacher should just think about the literary works that he or she likes the most in any language. It could be a great work of Russian literature, for example. It could be a work of English literature, French literature, American literature. The possibilities are really endless. And the question then would be, if the teacher knows this work of literature, several works of literature very well, the question would be, is there any possibility that there is an important philosophical question relating to law or politics in this literary work? And maybe it would be necessary for the teacher to read some commentaries, to acquire a greater understanding, to gain a greater understanding of the literary work. So, for example, I could imagine that many people who read Shakespeare's play Merchant of Venice or Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure, they know that the plays are in some ways about law. They are in some ways about law, but maybe they do not fully understand the philosophical questions that Shakespeare is investigating in these two plays. And so the only way I think the teacher could acquire that knowledge about the philosophical questions in these plays by Shakespeare would be through reading commentaries. But the point is the logical starting place. If a teacher is interested in teaching political and legal philosophy through literature, the logical starting place is those literary texts that the teacher already likes and appreciates, and some reflection, some review of, I suppose, one's library could be very helpful in this way.
Besides the 4 texts you already mentioned, can you recommend any other works of literature for the study of legal and political philosophy?
Yes, I could recommend several. The important thing to remember is that we could make a very long list. We could make a very long list of literary works that could be used to study political and legal philosophy. Let me mention a personal favorite of mine, a text that I teach almost every year in my course in the United States on this subject. I teach a course on political and legal philosophy through the study of great works of literature. And this is obviously one of the great works of world literature, Shakespeare's play Hamlet. And many people, when they hear me mention Hamlet, they will probably be a little surprised by this, because Hamlet does not have the reputation of being a work involved with a philosophical question about law or politics. But if somebody thinks about the play by Shakespeare, Hamlet, somebody thinks about the key developments in the play, I think the person will remember that politically there are many interesting things happening in Hamlet. For example, we learn early in the play from the Ghost that Hamlet's uncle has killed Hamlet's father, the former king of Denmark, and Hamlet's uncle has become the new king. And this is important because if what the Ghost is saying is true, then Hamlet's uncle is guilty of killing a king. And this is the crime. In English we call this regicide, killing the king. And we could say that Hamlet's uncle is a usurper, somebody who has become politically powerful through illegal action. If Hamlet's uncle is a usurper, if what the ghost is saying is true, then it is quite possible that Hamlet himself would be justified in killing his uncle. And Hamlet, throughout the play, talks about his desire to avenge his father's death. But his desire to avenge his father's death seems to many people to be largely a personal matter and not so much a political matter. But it's important to remember that Denmark is at this time in some kind of crisis. One of the famous lines from Act 1 of the play is, "Something is rotten in Denmark." And this gives some evidence that there is a serious political crisis taking place in Denmark. The crisis is related to the death of Hamlet's father and the fact that Hamlet's uncle is now the king. And I don't want to explain all of the questions that are relevant to this important philosophical matter relating to Hamlet's uncle and whether Hamlet himself would be justified in killing his uncle for the crime of regicide. I am simply saying that many people, when they think about Hamlet, they think about his desire to avenge his father's death as a purely political matter, or as a purely personal matter and not a political matter. But in fact, the play has many political aspects, and we can remember also at the end of the play, at the beginning of the play, the conflict between Denmark and Norway is mentioned, and this is another political dimension to the play that we should keep in mind. Can I recommend other works besides the play Hamlet? Yes. Shakespeare's history plays. Shakespeare's history plays provide a lot of interesting material for philosophical and legal and political reflection. We could begin with, for example, Shakespeare's Roman plays, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus, and Antony and Cleopatra. Shakespeare's plays about British history are also important in this regard. Other works of literature that I have used to teach political and legal philosophy include Mark Twain's famous novel Huckleberry Finn. Huckleberry Finn is very political in the sense that it is an exploration of slavery as an institution in the United States and the attitude of different people towards slavery. The events in Huckleberry Finn, even though the novel was written after the Civil War when slavery had been abolished, the events in Huckleberry Finn take place before the Civil War. And the events in the novel are related to, in some important ways, Mark Twain's childhood growing up in the state of Missouri. So I could mention Huckleberry Finn. I could mention a work of 20th century literature by a British writer. He was born in the United States, but he moved to England as a young man and became a British citizen, T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot wrote a very impressive play, about the murder of St. Thomas Becket. The play is called Murder in the Cathedral. And this is a story relating to the murder of Thomas Becket during the Middle Ages. This is a play that very few of my students know about when I am teaching it. My students don't know about it, but my students usually like reading this play very much. I mentioned Shakespeare, I mentioned Mark Twain. I could also mention Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens wrote a novel called Hard Times, which is very rich in political philosophy. Political philosophy, a very interesting question about principles by which a society should be governed, the main principles to govern a society, and also the principles by which parents should raise their children. And there's something about this novel, Hard Times. It might be of special interest for readers in Eastern Europe because in this novel, I think, as much as any novel that Dickens wrote, the humor is very dark. Dickens had a wonderful sense of humor, and in a few of his novels, the humor is very dark, and Hard Times is one such example. We could talk about other works. Some of these works, I think, are well known as containing important philosophical reflection relating to society and politics. We could mention, for example, Aldous Huxley's novel, Brave New World. We could mention the Russian writer's novel, Zamyatin, translated as We. I think the Russian is Mui. It's a science fiction, dystopian or anti-utopian novel, having some things in common with Aldous Huxley's novel, Brave New World. I'm trying to think of any other texts that I have used in recent years that I could mention. Those are mainly the primary texts I have been using: plays by Shakespeare, Billy Budd, Heart of Darkness, Mark Twain's novel Huckleberry Finn, T.S. Eliot's play Murder in the Cathedral, and also mentioning a work such as Brave New World, Yevgeny Zamyatin's Mui, and finally another novel by a British novelist, a very interesting novel, which I read many years ago, and one of my colleagues uses this as a way of teaching political philosophy. The author's name, William Golding, the novel Lord of the Flies. Lord of the Flies, trying to explain the behavior of human beings in a very primitive state when human beings are far away from all of the institutions of a developed society. So those are some of the texts that possibly could be used for teaching political and legal philosophy through literature.